Hey, what's up? I find it difficult to be concise about what I'm trying to say in this particular video. A lot of what I discuss on this channel really deals with the difficult contrasts between simple questions of principle and the more complex, murky questions we get into when we force ourselves to think about what's practical and what's possible in our lifetimes. What differences can we make in the next 10 years? I think those things are really worth dwelling on, even when they show up contradictions and paradoxes. And by contrast, if we don't think about that, if we just make declarations of unattainable things without thinking about the details, then we become laughable both to our supporters and to our detractors. There are many, many protests in the United States these days, just the last couple of years, sort of extreme student protests on American university campuses that were making demands their universities couldn't possibly help them with. Screaming outrage protests at the universities like they want their professors to somehow eliminate rape, anti-rape protests. But what are you actually asking the university to do? What is the possible and practicable solution you're proposing here? If there is something the university can do, then the protest isn't so ridiculous. Protests about status of black people in the United States. Now, again, it may be a very good cause. You may really want to improve the status of African Americans. And, obviously there have been terrible scandals about police brutality. Protesting at the police station is one thing. Calling for specific police reforms may be very meaningful. But when you look at a protest which is just kind of attacking the administration of the university, that's something very different. It's like, well, what are you actually asking the university to do? And what do your university professors have to do with it? Your university professors are not the commissioners of the police department. They're not the provincial government or the state government. Even when the message has some meaning, you often see these protests that are just sadly out of place. And again, they become laughable, not just to their detractors, to their opponents, but they're laughable even to people who would support them. Like, there are people who would like to see the quality of policing improved, the quality of black people's lives improved, and so on. Unfortunately, there are many, many examples of that kind possible. I think I've mentioned recently on the channel this issue of anti-Israel protests on American university campuses. If somebody had a protest in front of Bill Clinton's house, I assume Bill Clinton lives in a house. I don't know. Maybe he lives in a condominium. Maybe you could demand that Bill Clinton, in his retirement, could do more for the Palestinian peace process. But most of these cases, whatever, the University of Ohio or something, what do you want the professors at the University of Ohio to do? It's not possible, it's not practicable, and you're discrediting yourself because you've never dealt with these murky and difficult issues that separate a simple statement of principle from these questions of implementation. So you make yourself stronger, more meaningful, more salient, more respected by descending into those details and by admitting the limits to what you can do and what the government can do. If it's the government you're asking to change, you may be asking normal people to change. You may be asking McDonald's Corporation to change. You may be asking for some other kind of social change. Now, the second thing I wanted to mention here is that vegans start in a weak position because we haven't made anything obsolete. There's a saying people like to kick around: the Stone Age didn't end when people ran out of stones. It's when you have something better than the existing technology, you can make it obsolete. You can really offer a better alternative. Vegans are making an argument that they want people to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, not because they can replace the wrong thing. And nowhere is this more evident than in the case of vivisection. Vivisection, it's much more difficult to argue the ethical case against vivisection than to argue against eggs, chicken eggs. Chicken eggs are unhealthy. We don't got to make them obsolete. They're terrible for your health. You don't need them. You shouldn't eat them. They have cholesterol, etc. Nobody should eat chicken eggs. It's also an ethical issue. It's also an ecological and environmental issue, etc. but that's really quite an easy one to argue. I was in England when there were protests in the streets that were pro-vivisection, pro-animal experimentation, and they had people coming out and making quite powerful speeches saying that this type of science saved their lives. And we're not in a simple position to say as vegans, well, we have a better alternative. There's no need to torture monkeys in a laboratory because we have tofu. It doesn't work that way. And it's actually hard. I'd love to see someone like Unnatural Vegan really come out and admit where she stands on vivisection. I think anyone who's done the reading, on the one hand, is aware of the horrors, truly awful horrors of what goes on in laboratories all around the world in secret and for profit. I'm going to emphasize those 2 points. Atrocities being committed in secret and for profit. There's a Wikipedia article, I think, on a set of experiments that are known as the Pit of Despair experiments, torturing monkeys, and they couldn't have proven anything. They couldn't have discovered anything. It's not to find the cure for cancer. There's no justification of that kind. Amazingly cruel experiments done on animals just in the name of psychological research, where really, if you read the original proposal for the experiments, they couldn't have discovered anything. I have read accounts, critiques of experiments where they were torturing animals to death. I remember a set where they were breaking the necks of lambs, and it couldn't have proven anything about human health. It was just ridiculous. I mean, and at the end, the conclusions of the lab report after they tortured these animals to death was like, well, we didn't really learn anything. I guess this was a badly designed experiment, So, the notion of necessity as it applies to animal research is deeply flawed. Nevertheless, when you're looking into it, it's not the case that we can say in a simple and glib way, well, animal rights are universal, therefore all experimentation should be abolished, everyone should do what I say because I'm right, and the fact that I'm less than 1% of the population who knows about this and cares about this doesn't matter either. The fact that I'm a tiny minority for a totally unpopular movement that has zero credibility, that doesn't matter either. We're just going to demand this and keep on demanding it and not think through any of the implications. And if people point out that the progress of science relies on these things, we have no answer except to say it's morally wrong and I can't replace it. It's not like the Stone Age ending because we've got iron and bronze and steel. No. We want to end all scientific progress of this kind just because it's the right thing to do. Now, a more mature position is to say, look, I recognize that animal experimentation has gotten some results. It's horrible. It's terrible to admit. But as vegans, even though we can show examples of horrendous scientific experiments that torture animals to death for no good reason, the other side will have examples of experiments that found really meaningful and important results, including some of the results that support a vegan diet, by the way, where they're torturing animals and finding that a vegan diet is healthier than a meat-based diet. Many of you, if you read these kinds of scientific studies, you'll be familiar with those contradictions in life. But we can't just say the Stone Age ends when there's no need for stones anymore. We can't offer a simple superior substitute for what the infrastructure of animal exploitation now offers through vivisection. So it's actually very difficult to think about and talk about. Now, I compare this to 2 examples that I think are radically unfamiliar to vegans, because vegans have just been kind of playing these games. I think ethically, it's very problematic to have a private for-profit company generating nuclear power, running a nuclear power plant. I'm not against nuclear power. Nuclear power can be okay. It can be a good thing. It also has some terrifying ecological implications. But if we accept that we're going to live in a world with more than zero nuclear power, I do not think it's acceptable to have private for-profit corporations running those nuclear power plants. And the example of what happened at Fukushima Daiichi, that is doubtless in large part, due to the weakness of government oversight, it also illustrates the terrible, seemingly insoluble problems with having a private for-profit corporation running a nuclear power plant at all. If this needs to exist, if there's a question of necessity, why can't it be a charity? Gambling. This is number 2. Some people just feel that gambling is a simple, absolute ethical issue, in the same way vegans feel animal rights are an ethical issue. So therefore, there should be no gambling. But the more nuanced and complicated reality of what we deal with is that there will always be gambling. There will always be more than zero gambling, even if the government declares it completely illegal. And different countries around the world, including Canada during my youth, come up with peculiar halfway solutions of saying, look, let's separate the profit motive from gambling. Let's disallow private for-profit companies from gambling. But let's look at permitting charities to run casinos, which used to happen in Canada in my youth. Churches used to play blackjack. Used to be seriously like at the church down the street, they'd be having blackjack tables and this kind of casino gaming as a fundraiser, because somebody got cancer, they're raising funds for something. And then, of course, the government was operating its own casinos, which was a corrupting influence in the government. And over time, there were more and more casinos, and the matter of principle was eroded away. Nevertheless, I think that's also worth thinking about. It's not easy to just say, well, nuclear power is bad, so let's abolish nuclear power. But you can limit some of the evils and incompetence of human nature by saying, let's separate this from the profit motive. There's no way to eliminate gambling in society 100%, but you can have laws that say, let's try to limit the pervasive influence of gambling in society by trying to separate it from the profit motive. Now, ultimately, I don't actually know this happening with tobacco so much. It probably has happened with tobacco in some countries. But with alcohol, there have been many, many attempts to separate alcohol from the profit motive, to have some kind of government monopoly on alcohol, control the distribution of alcohol, limit the advertising of alcohol, to have non-profit shops controlled by the government instead of for-profit businesses selling alcohol. So, Ontario, where I grew up, it was also an example of this in my childhood. And before I was alive, one of my very elderly professors, he told some hilarious stories about what the alcohol control board was like in his youth. At one time, it was this kind of completely soulless bureaucracy, and it was part of a government effort to try to make alcohol an unattractive, non-profit sort of enterprise, to decrease what was then a real huge problem of alcoholism in Canada. Now, again, this also just became corrupted over time, and now more and more countries, even where government is involved, the alcohol industry resembles a for-profit operation. What's attainable in our lifetimes? I'm against vivisection. I would love to see vivisection eliminated 100%. If you present me with a law that says from now on, each and every example of vivisection, each project, each experiment has to be presented to Parliament, has to sit before Parliament for 2 months, and then get voted on by Parliament, I would support that law. It's not an abolitionist law that won't end vivisection, but that would massively rationalize vivisection, right? And it would limit the two factors I mentioned, that this is happening in secret, because it would make it transparent. Then anyone in the press can write an article about it. Anyone can examine it. Anyone can write to their member of Parliament, write to their member of Congress, right? It would limit the secrecy, and it would also limit the for-profit motive, right? If the justification for torturing a monkey to death is necessity, is that it's going to cure cancer, that it's going to have some amazing positive benefit, then why can't we have a democratic, publicly accountable process that actually questions that necessity, where there is a case to be made publicly and transparently, where someone has to justify why this monkey is going to be tortured to death? And again, if you look up, this stuff will give you nightmares. If you look up something like the Wikipedia article on the pit of despair experiment, horrible experiments that have happened in the past, torturing monkeys, torturing cats, or whatever, where nothing could possibly be found. It's very obvious that those worst excesses would not survive the public scrutiny of having the case made to Parliament, even if nobody in Parliament cared. If the newspapers could look at it, and the animal rights people could look at it, and people could laugh at the worst proposals, that would change things. Even the process for the laboratory, let's say it's a research laboratory at a university, even the process of them having to come up with a justification, them having to make their case, this would already limit vivisection. This would enforce a rationale for vivisection. And as I've been hinting at, I think it would be tremendously meaningful to pass a law saying, look, all vivisection at every stage has to be completely nonprofit. And you can even limit the salaries of the individual people involved. I could get into another story about that. Transparency in salaries can be a very powerful thing. In political science, this would be much too long if I get into that also. But to really try to eliminate the profit motive from it. So, okay, if this is done for medical necessity only, then why can't we have a democratic process that puts those questions of necessity on trial on a case-by-case basis? Obviously, this would exponentially reduce the amount of vivisection in any one country. And those of you who have experience working inside universities, the profit motive in the bureaucratic context of the university has bizarre effects on people. You have a department where the head of the department says, okay, this is how much lab space we have. So we need to write 30 funding proposals this year. So the professors are assigned tasks. You guys have to come up with 30 proposals for experiments. Doesn't matter if they're stupid. And out of those 30 proposals, we expect that maybe 7 of them will get funding, will get support. And we've got to do as many experiments as possible. We've got to justify the budget for the department. We have to have enough lab work going on to keep our master's students busy. We have a bunch of targets for a bunch of reasons that are ultimately financial. And completely meaningless research is being done all the time just to satisfy those economic and bureaucratic goals. And you can see that in the Department of Anthropology. You can also see it in departments of ecology. And you can see it in departments of the hard sciences. So sadly, the structure of funding, the economic factors, how they shape even academic research is a very powerful thing. And of course, once you get into the pure profit sector, pardon me, the pure private sector pursuit of profit, things can get even uglier. And we do have animals being tortured to death to make a redder shade of lipstick. Now, what I've talked through in this video will be shocking to many and most. My point is, yes, I'm interested in a 100% elimination of vivisection, but I'm interested in seeing results in my lifetime. I'm interested in really talking through what kind of legislation can happen before I die or in the next 10 years. So if you just want to make a statement of principle that all vivisection is evil, I really don't want to hear it. I want to hear what you can do about it. I don't want to be right. I want to win. Being right is easy. You want to sit in front of your camera on the internet and be right? Well, clap, clap, clap. We can all applaud that. You can have a little circle of people around you who send you fan mail and applaud what you're saying and say, wow, you're so right. It'd be so easy for me to come on here and say the same BS everyone else says on the internet and get my applause and get my tiny measure of fame and whatever. I'm not interested in being right. I don't want to be right. If this video offends you because you're an ethical vegan and all you want to do is demand the total abolition of vivisection, I feel you. Go ahead. Be offended. But when you've calmed down and you're not offended anymore, think about what you and me can actually do in the next 10 years. Okay? What I've just said, it may be wrong. I don't mind being wrong. I don't want to be right. I want to win. I want to make an actual difference in the real world for those monkeys that are in actual laboratories, having experiments performed on them for the sake of dentistry, for the sake of a redder shade of lipstick, for some psychological experiment that's complete BS. Ethically and morally, I agree, there is no such thing as necessary torture, as justifiable torture. But if you think that a tiny minority of despised people can snap their fingers and make the right thing happen just because it's right, you're dreaming. Wake up. Get organized. Look at the real-world factors. Think about real-world legislation that can make a difference in your country, wherever you're living right now. And just by orienting your discourse towards those attainable goals, you will avoid being a laughingstock. You will avoid being despised and sneered at, both by the people who disagree with you and the people who agree with you, in the way those university protesters were, because you will increasingly articulate your goals in relation to real-world problems, and you will be offering meaningful solutions. I wish we could just make meat and dairy agriculture obsolete, but we can't. I wish we could just make the scientific experimentation on animals obsolete, but we can't. What we're looking at is a period of history where we have to have complex disincentives to try to marginalize the exploitation of animals, to try to engage the public in some kind of productive discourse about improvement of the status of animals on planet Earth. And look, man, how do we put a man on the moon? Was it by holding protests in the streets and pointing at the moon and saying, I want to get there right now? No. Okay? There's a terribly convoluted and complicated process. There's a series of stages in between. And if you're immature about it, then ultimately you're just a madman pointing your finger at the moon, saying that's where I want to be.